this is rather strange. Typically I do the introduction. I'll start off with saying, good afternoon and welcome to the mostly monthly Enterprise Architecture Forum, held under the auspices of the Open Group, and then I'll hand over to somebody else. And it's not going to work this time. And in fact, this is the presentation that I gave at the London plenary session, which was a couple of months ago. And I got halfway through the presentation, and this is in a massive uh, venue, and the fire alarm goes off. This is halfway through the presentation. Everybody had to stand up and rotate. So please, let's stay away from the fire alarms. So this presentation is the architect's pivot from static blueprints to dynamic ecosystems. I think it's a long time in coming. Where we spent years, putting together these static models and road maps, and this is the way we're going, and all that type of stuff. And then, hey, the real world happens. Yeah, the board changes its mind. A new application. There's a new competitor. The market is actually living and dynamic. So it's how to move from static blueprints to dynamic ecosystems. So the outline of the presentation is an introduction, the historical mandate, and then I fell down a rabbit hole, getting into the South African scrap metal ecosystem. We did a bit of a training course to a client in the scrap metal sector, where it was why enterprise architecture as an introduction, and we did a toolset implementation, and that was it. Except it kind of scratched my interest, going back to that exploration, mining, metals, and minerals day, and Gary's here somewhere. There we go, where we put together that industry reference model. And that was a very long time ago, 20 years ago. And that became, in fact, it became the first industry vertical within the Open Group. And that as an industry reference model, it's been shared thousands of times. So it's pretty much a de facto standard. One of the things I'm thinking, hey, shoot, where does scrap metal fit into that particular model? Isn't it time to resurrect it? I mean, it's an idea. Looking at that as something different. Yeah, so it's applying ecosystems architecture, which is it's a different way of thinking, using TOGAF as a foundation. So it's not different to TOGAF; it kind of fits into TOGAF. So it's an extension. And then really into the conclusion, how do we move forward? And of course, TOGAF is a registered trademark of the Open Group. So the historical mandate, and this goes back 1999. This is really scratching the archive. The McKinsey proposed a simulation project into South African breweries, and it was a request for architecture work where I was tasked to do an analysis of what McKinsey were proposing. That was the first time we looked at the Vensim tool, and we've got a couple of people who are deep into Vensim at the moment. So it's a systems dynamic. It's a simulation tool where you can run things like Monte Carlo simulations. It's used across science. It's used in banking as well. For example, where I think it was the World Bank put together a model for Malawi, a good couple of years ago. And it's also used in the mining sector. For example, looking at furnaces, the actual the blast walls, and how long they can last, and things like that. So the idea of using Vensim as a different approach to do simulation into beer division, where it actually kind of builds on ecosystems, because of the fact they wanted us to look at price sensitivity. So if you increase the price of beer, what does it mean to volumes? How do you take into account all of these soft factors and the dynamics of the system, etc.? So it was a very interesting piece of work, and I came out with a model that kind of looked like this, as a high level architecture representation. This is back in 1999, as I said, and it brought in, for example, the Zachman framework, looking at primitive models, also depth within the Zachman framework, etc. The different data stores and so on and so forth. So this is kind of, and that's where we would put Vensim into the picture. The requirements were around very large models, rapid prototyping and simulations, diagnostics, game theory simulations, etc. So the ask was pretty large. At the time, Beer Division had a whole bunch of tools in space. So Kine was our. Does anybody remember Kine? So was data modeling. Yeah, there we go. Some nods. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Aris, most of you would know, Arena, Alcov, Vensim, Decision Pro, etc. So it's a typical organization where we had a number of tools, looking at modeling and simulation. Um, so the downside of this is Television decided not to go with the proposal. So that's part of the frustration. And then from there, I moved on to another project, which was the Global IT Strategy Project for SAB PLC. That was sponsored by Graham Mackay, who was the CEO of SAB PLC at the time. And you kind of recognize this type of model. Uh, what made this different is for the first time it really put a focus on business architecture, actually understanding what the business needed. Typically, an IT strategy project would not really get that full requirements out of the business. So it went through the business model, the current position, the drivers for change, the challenges, best practices, etc., key opportunities, and then it really got a very good understanding. And this was a SAB PLC project. So in other words, it looked at all the European countries and South Africa and your Maltas, etc. And that kind of really looks like what TOGAF 10 evolved to, or TOGAF 9. It's your typical top circle view, where you've got a request for architecture work turning into a statement of architecture work, coming up with a phase B, business architecture, phase C, uh, data applications and technology, where you want to go to, what are the opportunities and solutions, and how are we going to go forward. Again, the frustration. And because of my role, I was involved in a number of IT strategy projects. From AT&T, Deloitte, basically all of the organizations. And really, what you ended up with was some very beautiful PowerPoints, yeah, which kind of become shelfware. Yeah. And again, that was the frustration because of the fact that as the business evolves and changes, this work just couldn't keep pace. So if you've got an architecture roadmap that is looking 3 to 5 years ahead, okay, it's a great thing to have. But is it living and dynamic? Yeah. Does it take into account changes within the business? Is it your business case development, your phases E and F, of the TOGAF cost circle? How do you prioritize? How you do the different trade-offs? So there's clearly something missing. That's really it's focusing on the static structural design, um, and there's an inherent complexity within your enterprise architecture practice in how to address this complexity in a format that it delights, or in a format that your stakeholders can absorb. Focus on communication, on simplicity, and be able to hide the complexity of meta models and Zachman frameworks and all of that type of stuff behind a brick wall, where the stakeholder actually doesn't really give a damn. Really what they want to do is have clear guidance on how to drive change. Uh, um, so in other words, that gap was there, and so it ties into the McKinsey stuff as well. It's the need to come up with a dynamic simulation type of approach, which can be done at multiple layers within the business. Whether it's strategic, yeah, the strategy layer, or into your segments, which could be in the SAB case, different countries, or down to a capability level. So it's how do you have that traceability? In other words, if something changes at the strategy layer, how do you see its ripple effect through the different architectural layers? So that things can bubble up from the bottom, that it becomes a learning organization that's dynamic, that's experimental. Gary, the source of innovation, right? So with that, as a historical background and the frustration coming out of it, this is where we get into this scrap metal ecosystem. So this turned into a bit of a personal project, you know. It was a definite rabbit hole. So there's no paying client behind this. Pretty upset caller because of the fact that this is what I was doing. And I have great fun with this. You know, this is the type of stuff which I'm maybe a little bit obsessed about. I, coming out of the scrap metal work that I did, I read as part of the context. I read this particular document, and it said, state intervention in the scrap metal industry. The current ongoing scenario in the scrap metal industry is a classic economic example of market failure and warrants government intervention. Yeah, and then I kind of read the document, given all of these type of points, and what struck me is that it was kind of linear thinking. That soft factors and feedback loops and causality and a whole bunch of those business type dynamics weren't taken into account, and that resulted in me going straight down the rabbit hole. And then one of the key things coming out of this was the introduction of a price preference system, and that came out of the ITAC, which is the International Trade and Administration Commission, where they basically put in order to encourage local use of scrap, they put a price preference system in place. In other words, that there would be a discount for local purchase. And that discount had a whole pile of unintended consequences. And that's really the essence of what this presentation is about. So in other words, something which actually looks very logical if you approach it from a linear thinking perspective can have drastic unintended consequences. And that can, the numbers in this particular case study that I've worked through are horrendous. We're talking billions. Uh, um, and so it's kind of how to pull all of this together. Um, and the process complexity behind it, and the import taxes, and ready to reduce and export and trying to keep it within South Africa. The net effect is that the system reacted in the exact opposite as what was intended. So that's again getting into causal loop diagrams and unintended consequences. So that's where I put together an app, and this is the version 1, which I made a terrible mistake in. So I ended up having to redo it completely because of the fact that I simplistically combined ferrous and red metal. So the iron versus the copper and the bronze and the brass, etc. While the dynamics of the system are completely different. So that's where I'm very thankful to Jeff and team. You'll see in the thanks. You kind of pointed me in the right direction in order to correct that. You can kind of see the types of 187 billion, 62,000 people, the collapse, etc. So this was you know the relatively simplistic view of it. And then coming out of his work being done within the open group, focusing specifically on ecosystems architecture. Um, so within the open group, you have the architecture forum, and then there can be various work groups within that particular forum. So there's a very focused team who are working on enterprise ecosystems. So it's not replacing enterprise architecture; it's seen to be in addition to, and complementary to what enterprise architecture is about. So they basically came up with this Viper model, which is a health check. So this is kind of what I went through, and I came up with a score, saying that from a viability perspective, it's not economically sustainable. It's on a death spiral as a system. Integrity, system boundary failures, massive leakages, built arbitraries, no material flow accounting. So these are the issues coming up behind it. So coming out of that work, I then fell down the rabbit hole, and this is the version 2, which is now in an app form, which has both the ferrous and the red metals view of the world, with a Viper you know, ecosystem health assessment. It comes roughly to the same type of answer, but it gives the ability to actually go and kind of really get your head around where is the system going wrong. Yeah. Is that, can you see it from the back? Shall I zoom in a bit? Is that fine? So it looks at you know, the definitions, viability, integrity, probability, responsiveness, etc. So this is something new coming out of this ecosystems work, looking at the viability of the ecosystem, and that's really beyond just the center of the enterprise. So I'm just going to just take a step back and take you through some of the aspects of what I ended up doing. So this is the high level executive summary. So the numbers haven't changed much. You know, the 62,000. Again, that's one of the difficulties in South Africa is actually pinning a hard and fast number. Because those 62,000, I've heard estimates range from 62,000 to over 400,000 people that are impacted. And I think one of the advantages of applying this type of approach is you can have a slider. Is it 62,000 or is it closer to 400,000? And that's where the simulation comes to play because of the fact that you can test alternative numbers, parameters, dimensions, etc. And then really what it did, it came through the root causes of the architecture failure, and then solutions to it. So I'm not going to get into this now. I'll come back to it. There are various system archetypes. So this is something which I feel is extremely important to architecture practices and enterprise architecture teams. It's the whole focus on systems thinking. Understanding the difference between systems thinking, causal loop diagrams versus system dynamics, the ability to drive simulations, and business dynamics. So in business dynamics, that's where you start introducing soft factors, like staff morale and aspects like that. But really, what this is saying that coming out of the work of Senge and team, there's a whole you know number of archetypes which they were new, is kind of looking at why. So the systems that fail, the tragedies of the commons, etc. And then also being able to bring in sensitivity analysis, where you can look at the different aspects behind it, critical, um, the impact of subsidies, and then from there into a systems explorer. So your feedback loops, where you can start driving an interactive analysis. Um, so the various targets, the leverage points, policy recommendations, and then looking at aspects like the theft spiral. So this is taking into account aspects like global metal prices, the theft, the infrastructure damage, and so on and so forth. So these are all of the factors, the parameters which go into the model, which you can then simulate to test the impact of change. So you're moving from something which is static into something which is living and dynamic. And with the move into artificial intelligence, I think the game's changed. Yeah. The fact now being is that you could have agents running around, Flexity Pro or whatever you want to use, that can look at social media, all these different information sources, pull that together, structure it in such a format that you can then feed into this type of approach. Yeah, and that's where it becomes living and dynamic because of the fact that you're getting your agents to run around and pull the information and structure it in such a format that you can then drive decisions out of it. So you're kind of looking at you know, export restrictions, domestic price suppression. So hey, shoot, if you are giving a price preference where it's sold cheaper than the international metal price, where does that difference go? Yeah, who actually gets the value of that difference? Is it the people that collect the scrap? Actually, no. Yeah. So in other words, there's an artificial, almost like a buffer zone, created in the mill industry. Reduced collection. Yeah, the amount of money which is paid into the scrap metal harvesters, the people that run around in poverty, they, they're the people that carry the brunt of this of this. So there's and actually really unpacking each one of these, the suppression. See, so this is the complexity of an ecosystem around scrap metal. The stakeholders, the differing agendas, the tensions. It's- So that's really the point I wanted to make up to here. I'm going to come back to this. I just want to drop into a document. I need to keep an eye on the time because I do get carried away on this. So somebody will tell me what. So all of this was then turned into a document. Yeah. So it's basically the South African scrap metal ecosystem, a comprehensive systems analysis guide. And what I did here is integrating TOGAF ecosystems architecture, systems thinking, systems dynamics, and business dynamics. So it was a bit of a meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And it's not quite 42. Uh, um, so out of that, I'm just going to run through the table of contents because of the fact that's probably a good way to see the linkage to the TOGAF standard. So I'll drop into some key points. So there's pure TOGAF. Vision, phase B, phase C, phase D. So what I did find is that the TOGAF framework is a very useful structuring tool in order to take all of this complexity, that I've shown you in that app, and structure it in a format that it can make sense. Uh, um, and into phase E and F, implementation, governance, conclusions, the synthesis, recommendations, and then a whole pile of glossaries. Kind of getting consistency of terminology, understanding all the legal laws and regulation. Because even between government departments, there is tension in the scrap metal industry. When you're looking at metals and energy versus land. Um, looking at those type of dimensions. So the purpose and the scope. Um, it, it's really using this whole circular economy as a key focus area. Again, within the open group, in another forum, there's a forum called Open Footprint. Have any of you heard of the Open Footprint forum? Nobody. I think that's something which we need to have another presentation on if we can find somebody to volunteer. So the Open Footprint Forum has recently, like in the last 2 weeks or so, they have published a comprehensive data model focusing specifically on the open footprint, which is the whole ecological. It's more than just carbon tax and carbon accounting, etc. So there is a huge amount of value going into organizations like CITA, and organizations. In fact, it's going to be published as an open standard, so you can access it out of the Open Group library. It's well worth downloading and having a look at. I think it's going to address a lot of the challenges coming out of this work when it comes, looking across different data sources and how do we pull it together and how do we apply an architectural style in order to be able to get that type of information sorted out. So here you can see the capacity and then why the architecture analysis, why to make that different. And then coming to an integrated methodology, which is really using systems thinking, systems dynamics, and business dynamics, and yeah, looking at the key difference. And I think one of the key traps that we tend to fall in. It's very easy to build a causal loop diagram. It's thing relationship thing, and hey, there's a pretty picture that explains what you think it is, but that's only 5% of the problem. It's useful for getting understanding, But it's only when you reach the point that you start moving into systems dynamics and business dynamics that you have the ability to, drive the simulation, and it's moving from, hey, thoughts and feelings, this is how the system works, into something which is, you know, quantifiable. So, so it's as a key focus. As I say, I'm relying on somebody to tell me when you've had enough. So uh, the causal loop diagrams, you know, the key terminology coming out of systems dynamics itself, the stocks, the flows, the parameters, the policies. This was also built into that model specifically as an input. So it's going into things like this, where you're looking at aspects like, is it a stock? What type of resource is it? Uh, what is the desired value, the rate of change, and so on and so forth. So that these then become the parameters that you can then feed into the simulation. That it becomes a snapshot, which then becomes living and dynamic. Uh, Measurement, inflow drivers, outflow drivers, etc. So it becomes almost like a meta model, yeah, for constructing the way you build your Vensim models. And obviously, it would make a lot of sense to tie that back into the way you configure your enterprise architecture repository and your meta model. So things like your flows, your processing, export rate, theft rate, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge opportunity to get this to really be living and dynamic if it was fed from multiple sources, that you can pull, from differing sources, like I'll show you, through using AI tools and then processing it. So the focus on policy, and then a number of standards I've covered, and then bringing TOGAF as the process backbone. So so I used as I've shown you, TOGAF to structure the document, the vision, business, uh, phase C, phase D, E, F, and G. And then, the ecosystem extensions. I think, this is the type of work, if, as members of the open group, where you can get actively involved, where the members can then fly, hey, shoot, we want to focus a specific work group on how to use or how to apply enterprise ecosystems thinking using simulation. How would you go about it, in the form of a white paper or an extension to the TOGAF standard? Um, So, things like, node recursivity, causal dynamics, probabilistic governance, the VIPO assessment, etc. So, these would then form, extensions, not replacing extensions to, the current, TOGAF standard, if that made sense and if the members got behind it. And so this is the type of work that could be done there for that matter. Um, this is something which I wish I had read 20 years ago, make it 30 years ago, is this whole Vanilla Meadows hierarchy. Has anybody heard of this before? No. This is something which I find extremely powerful. Yeah. Um, I think it would make sense to get into it now. I think, and that's really what we've been doing up to now, is we've been confusing you know, the low priority buffers, stocks, sizes, which is really what's happened. I mean, the whole PPS invention is really around low impact or low effectiveness changes, while the important stuff, yeah, the high impact stuff has been excluded. So it requires, it's a different way of thinking. It's a different mindset. Where if you've gone, this type of route where you've made sense, it's really sense making of the complexity of the system in a format that it can be simulated and explained in a format that people can understand. So then when it comes to setting policy or changing the way systems work, it can really be fact-driven, information-driven. Is this making sense to you? Yeah. So this is really going through the whole Viper assessment. 32% different between the two aspects. So I'm not going to dwell on that in too much detail. And then again, this is getting into the nodes and all of this type of stuff. Resource generators, the nodes, bringing up key facts behind it, aggregators, processes, regulators, and so on and so forth. Looking at the information flow. Um, They're getting into stakeholder analysis, which is really one of the key changes getting into TOGAF version 10 is the increased emphasis on stakeholders, their concerns, and so on and so forth. So really looking at the power levels, the current positions, and so on. So this is anybody who's gone through TOGAF will recognize this as this is pretty much pure TOGAF. But then also getting into the stakeholder tensions, etc. Yeah, mills versus recyclers, and formal versus informal groups, domestic versus export allocation. So what this document does, getting back to this view, you can now do scenarios, simulations, where you can look at changing the subsidies, and like run a simulation. What does it do to the differing graphs below it? Um, the ability to do scenario comparison with the different types of policy. So in other words, if the policy is on where we are current, or are we going to focus on market reform, or inclusive growth, or the status quo plus? So then this gives you, different ways of informing policy alternatives. So if you kind of think of it, you've got your strategic layer, which sets the vision and the direction of the organization, and the resource allocation policy. Then you've got tactical, which is the assignment of resources according to that particular policy. Then you've got managerial, which is the effective utilization of the assigned resources. And then you've got operation, which is the efficient delivery. So in other words, if you start applying this thinking, you can then have traceability going up as well as down, of the applications. So in other words, at a managerial level, if the system from a plan, do, check, act, correct, act, a Stuart type Deming's cycle, that would then inform going up and down if you apply this type of approach. So it opens up a whole bunch of differing possibilities, and a different way of kind of thinking about it from a strategic perspective. If that makes sense to you. So then, looking at the cost benefits of the different methods, key metrics, being able to look at changing it, how to apply remediation, etc. Being able to look at the time dimension, and I think that's also one of the key aspects, is treating time as a key factor. We've been taking snapshots. So in other words, it's not that easy to kind of put the time dimension in a format that you can then simulate. So in other words, hey, shoot, instead of looking 5 years ahead, which is okay, well, actually we're going to look a couple of months ahead. Does reality actually tie back to what we've proposed, or does it differ? If it differs, to what extent? How do we need to change and correct that thinking, going back into the modeling? You might update, the causal loop diagram, or the business dynamics diagram, or you know, the the business dynamics diagram. So then it becomes a continual learning loop, where using new techniques coming out of artificial intelligence, where you can now pull those type of sources of information together far easier than you've ever been able to do in the past. Being able to filter, structure, and feed it in. So that kind of gives us the opportunity to move from something which is static into something which is living and dynamic, and it's fed by the changes in the broader ecosystem. Sensitivity analysis, I'm not going to get into. You can also run Monte Carlo simulations as well, with the differing focuses, your current policy, etc. Yeah. So now we're getting into the probabilistic aspect of the ecosystem's approach, which is kind of different. You can look at your various stakeholder interventions, looking at your informal waste pickers. Is that okay from a size perspective at the back? Is it okay? Can you read it? Yeah. So you can see your key needs. So this is really stakeholder analysis coming out of the open group type of work. Yeah. Criminal networks, we've got to take them into account. Yeah. Affected communities. So you can see, this is like far broader than just the enterprise. Yeah. Yeah. It's the ecosystem of the enterprise. Not only nationally but also globally. Because of the fact that China and India are buying scrap metal at discounted prices, through billets going through, which is kind of disrupting the system. Yeah. So it's the metals are still leaving the country. So the value is not being realized. So if that's happening, and it's pretty obvious that's happening, why can't you fix it? Yeah. So it requires far more agile, adaptive responses in policy due to or from changes which you can substantiate with the proper analysis and information. I think one of the problems that we have in South Africa is our stats department has been hollowed out. It's got 50% less of the capacity that it had. Ideally, this type of stuff would be done, through that type of department, or even making that type of information available. One of the things I've come across is that econometrics type of thinking, or econometrics, just pure numbers, within the systems dynamics community, and also within some of the economist community. There's the shift to using systems dynamics and systems thinking as a way of doing um, economics and economical planning. So it's quite an exciting time, given all of these type of changes. Yeah, circular economy, waste reduction, resource efficiency, and then again being able to drill down to specific aspects behind it. Why is that red on that particular line? Why is that green on that particular line? What are the recommended interventions? What should you do in order to? So something like inclusive transformation coming out of all of this work is the answer that makes the most sense. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been done behind that as well. So there's a circularity dashboard, yeah, with the various measures behind it. The fact is, we're really off the mark. If we're going to hit those targets, it's not going to happen. And then the value chain behind it, stepping through the generation, the collection, the aggregation, and so on and so forth. So you drill down into collection specifically, the gathering of scrap metal, the informal sector that would happen. It's my watch. Theft and illicit extraction, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of counterintuitive things that have come out of this work. Such as investing in security had a greater return than tightening up on the PPS aspects. The policy timeline itself is quite interesting as well. So in other words, we're going all the way back to May 2013, and how that changed over time. So this is the timeline against the information that I've shown you, and how it impacted it. So, it's still in a process of change. So there's a PPS sunset clause, which is scheduled for, yeah, July 27th. So you've got 430 days and 14 months to go. Um, the value chain I've kind of shown you to a certain extent, getting back from our return of life. So it's from cradle to grave. That's kind of what we were doing in M. From yeah exploration right through to rehabilitation, um, budgeting and interventions, KPI monitoring, legislation framework, etc. Um, so you can kind of these are the ones which are kind of active and across the different streams. So there is so much to get your head around. I think that's one of the limitations of a human brain. You know, 7 plus minus 2. By applying this type of approach, ecosystems analysis, to the discipline of enterprise architecture, still keeping the rigors of the engineering approach through meta models and causal loop diagrams and different modeling styles and so on and so forth. The ability to simulate it, the ability to kind of look at it, print it out, and say, well, actually, this doesn't make sense, so that you can then start doing work groups where you pull people together, show this type of information, show the model. This is what's happening. Where is it breaking? What do we need to change? What do we need to fix? What are our assumptions? And then using that type of approach to guide effective change into organizations. So, it's not a replacement to enterprise architecture at all. It's supplementary. Yeah. And then obviously, the glossaries and the terms and all of this type of stuff. So, it's a massive piece of work. It's quite a lot to take in half an hour. Um, so basically, being able to get right down to you know, distributions and gaps, right down at resource levels, across actors, cross boundary value chains, industry scrap cycles, the business process models. And again, there are real gaps in the amount of time that it takes and the lack of system support in order to get that flow of information. So in other words, it becomes part of the way the system is disrupted. So there's a whole bunch of process weaknesses, for example. The time taken. So from an export permit, the paperwork, the paper flow, domestic circulation, price determination. So these are all steps with differing discounts and complexities and so on and so forth. And these are type of things which are given the ability to use AI to accelerate development, uh, um, using stuff coming out of the Open Footprint Forum for data models, given the ability to reverse engineer existing applications and structures, yeah, being able to kind of pull that information out of legacy systems in a format you can then build forward into the future. I think there's a huge opportunity to apply this type of thinking to that environment. So it's getting down to the data architecture, looking at the different players. The current state, fragmented, external subscription based, format only. So the information flow is a clear handicap as well. So I hope I'm not depressing you. Yeah. Yeah. It is a system that is on life support. It's not going to make it unless we do something about it. Yeah. Um, Passing data, then into the application architecture. Um, so you can see how powerful TOGAF is, as a as a structuring framework in order to be able to get the different domains done. And then basically getting into your proposals. So in other words, this is not yet in operation, as of December. You know, so things that you could do from an application architecture perspective that would go to directly contribute to fixing yeah, this problem, yeah, which can then be turned into another iterations of the TOGAF ADM, which is, it's a request for architecture work turning into a statement of architecture work, where the scope of that piece of architectural work is to address this. Yeah, there's your scope of work. Yeah, there's your project. Yeah, yeah. Let's take that forward. Right? See, so it's a way of kind of. I was looking at the capabilities, um, you know, application integration silos, um, application architecture permits, down to the technology architecture as well. So down to the standards, industry systems, external dependencies, you know, baseline target gap candidate, you know, pure TOGAF, incentives. Right. So I think I've kind of overloaded you with content. My apologies for doing so. It's a really it's a lot to take in. This is something which you could spend a couple of days of going through with the key stakeholders, like the scrap metal crowd, like the governance bodies which are also being formed. Yes, this is getting back to the Donna Meadows work. So in other words, these are it's using, and this is very powerful stuff. Where the 12 leverage points coming out of the Donna Meadows work is ranked, from the low to the high. So currently, what we're doing is we're kind of doing this type of stuff over here. The buffers, you know, the delays. What's really needed are these up here. Because that's when it comes to transformation. That's the area, the collection that would drive the most positive change, most positive systemic change. So I think one of the traps that we fall into is that we can confuse activity with progress. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the huge powers that comes out of this Donna Meadows work. Yeah, so um, I also wanted to show you the critical paths. So then, this is the governance framework. Right. So for scaring people off. If we get in, so we've gone through all of this. Um, Now, this is really, the key point as well is the human costs. That it's the waste. 62,000 to whatever. Their contribution is 82% of the recycling work. The amount of value that actually reaches them, in this system is incredibly small. Yet they carry the bulk of the work. And then getting into my AI space, from an enterprise architect, what I had fun doing is that I kind of created multiple personas, where I had, for example, an email to the enterprise architecture team from the systems dynamics specialist. So these are two personas within AI where they're actually kind of coming with different backgrounds and differing profiles, where I even applied the Myers-Briggs type of profile to them in order to get the different thinking styles going, and kind of get them to discuss. It's the new ways of thinking that can come out of this, and things which are actually less obvious, suddenly kind of jump forward. And then there's also work which is also moving forward is things like this, the anti-search mechanism. So in other words, the book that I'm coming to, this was a topic area within that. Um, this is a 2D version. There's a 3D version of this work that's, in fact, the email came out today, from the vendor. That, so in other words, we're moving into being able to simulate this type of stuff in a 3D type of environment, which is pretty important. So you can then start identifying what is missing, from all of that analysis, because you've got all of that stuff. You're sticking it into a graph, and you are using tools like this in order to understand, where are the gaps. It's almost like a jigsaw where, the piece is missing, but you can understand what's missing by the outlines of the contour of what's there. So, I mean, this is just really scratching the surface, the new techniques and the new way of applying this type of thinking, given the changes in the tool sets and, the thinking around, ecosystems architecture. So with that, I'd like to get to a quick conclusion. To me, it's fundamental is that we need to extend the enterprise architecture function. It's really running an EA practice like a business. There's a very clear understanding of who the stakeholder is and what is your value proposition as well. It's kind of putting in those learning loops and those feedback loops in order to take that forward. It's putting knowledge management and from an enterprise architecture team perspective, where they can become the custodians of that intellectual capital. I'm not saying owners, but the custodians, because really what they are is that they're positioned, extremely well positioned, to convert personal tacit knowledge into organizational knowledge through the act of the modeling. Coupling that with AI, in other words, where you can start pulling from different sources, the type of stuff that I've just taken you through, where you are managing intellectual capital as that resource, where you are running it like a business with a very clear offering. So if your stakeholders are the scrap metal sector, what is the offering that you provide, given this type of work? And it's an open system. So it's the aspect of looking after intellectual capital as a resource, applying new ways of thinking. Yeah, it's a way to reduce, for example, decision biases. Yeah, when it comes to a board of directors, getting back to that first slide. Yeah, how many boards of directors truly understand the complexity of the ecosystem? Yeah, we're probably talking about 8-10%, right? So in other words, there's some very interesting work around what makes a high performance board. In other words, where there are aspirational practices, like, for example, reducing decision biases, evaluating resource allocation. So you've got your strategy, your tactics you are doing resource allocation. Yeah. So what guides that? What information is required to guide that? The stocks and the flow, assessing value drivers, um, debating strategic alternatives. Like that example which I showed you, where there are differing policy alternatives. How do you select the best one? Now, if you don't have this type of capability, how do you expect a board of directors to make the right decision without having objective information behind it, where it's not pure systems thinking, but it's systems dynamics and business dynamics to inform better decisions. So I think, I just want to say thank you to some of the key people. So Jeff and Nancy, the Recycling Association of South Africa, RASA, do very good work. It's good to look up what they've done. There are a number of presentations out there. Donald McKay, he was interviewed on Business Day. you know, so there's a lot of papers that he's written in the space as well. Um, and then, to the authors of the Ecosystems Architecture book, which is available on Kindle, it's well worth reading. Um, Raoul is actively engaged in the current or the new book that we're busy putting together. Um, Interestingly enough, somebody like Neil Fishman. Neil Fishman wrote a book on the Zachman framework, which was really a good couple of years ago. What's really neat about that particular book is he introduced the concept of DNA, using DNA of systems for the Zachman framework. It's the participation. I think that's one of the huge value potentials of open group membership is that you can form part of these groups. You can help shape the standards. You can get involved in this development work. You can chat to people like Raoul. He's on the call. He's one of the chief architects in Honda. So it's kind of building up that personal network, and as I say, enterprise architecture should come with a health warning. You can turn into an obsession quite easily, but from a career path and from a professional growth perspective, and the probability of still being able to make a massive difference in the world of AI, architecture to me is still one of the key and one of the most important aspects as we move forward. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I hope I didn't overload you too much. I probably took too much of your time, but thank you very, very much.